Welcome back to the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to preserving the history of boxing and its larger-than-life characters, and is brought to you by Clear Contender Media. Now, here's your host, Casey Kid History Callanan.
What's up, everybody? My name's Casey Callanan. I figured before we do this first episode, before we get my first real character profile episode in, I would cut a introductory podcast, kind of just explaining who I am, what my intentions are with this podcast, and why I wanted to do this. So my name's Casey Callanan. As you heard on the intro, they call me Kid History. Actually, literally no one has ever called me Kid History in the history of my life. But I thought it would be a hilarious self-imposed nickname to throw out there for this project of really just trying to bring light to these characters of yesteryear that make the sport of boxing great. I think the entertainment value in boxing goes beyond what happens in the ring. I think individuals that go above and beyond just being a great in-ring performer are the ones that I remember the most and that I love the most. There is something great about someone that can just shut their mouth, go into a match and dominate. But then again, there's also something great about someone who talks trash, vis-a-vis Vinny Pazienza. But then again, one of my all-time favorite characters is Freddie Roach, the choir boy. I'm not talking about Freddie Roach, the manager. I'm talking about Freddie Roach, the fighter in the 80s. The choir boy. You know about the choir boy. So anyways, just some background on me. I am a boxer. Every single day, I'm in the gym training. I'm 32 right now. They say that is the height of your fighting prime. I am not a professional fighter by any means. I am a full-time marketing and communications professional. I'm a writer. I have a background in journalism. I love to tell stories. I love to report on what happens. I love to be objective. I have a journalism degree from West Virginia University, and I'm just finishing up my master's in business administration degree right now. But what's most important to me is, with this journalism background, is telling a story objectively and trying not to editorialize. Of course, on this podcast, I will be editorializing and throwing my opinions out there pretty relentlessly. But I do want everyone to keep in mind that I am the least mean-spirited person that I think you'll ever meet. And there's just not a negative bone in my body. I don't want to hurt anyone by coming on this podcast. And if I'm talking a little trash here and there, it's all in good spirit. It's all just trying to bring some levity to these characters. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm not trying to talk any trash. You're going to hear some future episodes. There's actually the first episode that I released with this episode. This is episode 1. And then episode 1A is going to be about Paulie Malignaggi. You know, I'm going to throw some shade out there or some heavy opinions out there. But again, I'm just trying to be objective. I'm trying to call it like I see it. I'm trying to call it by what I have seen as a boxing observer. I love this sport more than any other sport, and maybe more than just about any other tangible thing or you know, entity in this life. It's I could go on for hours on why I love boxing, but most why I love boxing has to do with the resilience factor, that what applies inside a boxing ring applies in life. And if I couldn't borrow some of what I've learned about boxing and applied it to life, I just wouldn't be anywhere. You have to be able to take punches in this life. You have to be able to learn how to box metaphorically, being a boxer and not trying to go for knockout punches in life. You throw enough of those haymakers, you're going to be off balance and you're going to get hit. So I always try to bring back boxing and how I can utilize what I've learned about this great sport and utilize it in my everyday life. I live in Baltimore, Maryland. I have a lovely girlfriend that I live with named Soroya. She's means everything to me, and she's my little buddy, and you will hear from her on this podcast. In fact, I bring her on to a future podcast that I will be releasing in coming weeks about Dangerous Dana Rosenblatt, the fighting pride of Malden, Massachusetts. So just to give you a kind of a preview of what you kind of characters you can expect to be hearing on this podcast in future episodes, I'm going to run the gamut. You're going to hear about superstars, heavyweight champions like Lennox Lewis, but then I'm also going to dive into some characters that I'm pretty sure you've never heard of, such as maybe Chalky Wright. You might have heard of him, maybe not. We'll talk about Butch Lewis. We're not just going to talk about fighters. That's why it's and beyond. We're going to talk about promoters. You're going to learn about Butch Lewis. What do you know about Butch Lewis, the promoter of Mike and Leon Spinks? What do you know about Butch Lewis? You're going to learn about Butch Lewis on this podcast. You're going to learn about Piano Mover Jones. Maybe that might be the best nickname in the history of not only sports but life. A Piano Mover Jones. You're going to go toe-to-toe with Piano Mover Jones? We'll stay tuned to the Characters of Boxing podcast, and you're going to learn about who Piano Mover Jones is. I dare you to try to Google that. You're going to learn about things on this podcast that you can't even Google. I learned about Piano Mover Jones in a book, son. And that book was a book about Archie Moore, the old mongoose, the pride and joy of San Diego, California. He also was from St. Louis, but spent most of his life in San Diego. Of course, you should know who Archie Moore is, but do you know who Piano Mover Jones is? I read about him in The Ageless Warrior. That's an amazing book about Archie Moore that everybody who's into boxing should check out at some point. I'm wearing a Wildcard Boxing Club shirt right now. It's got the Filipino flag on it as well. I think my favorite place in the world is the Wildcard Boxing Club out there on Vine Street in Hollywood. And I think anyone who's a fighter should at least poke their head in there and buy some merchandise from Freddie Roach. That's his gym. That place is amazing. I go in there and I train whenever I am fortunate enough to be in California. And the ultimate character, Freddie Roach's older brother, Pepper Roach, is he's still in there. I don't know how many strokes he survived, but if you ever get a chance to go to the Wildcard Boxing Club in Hollywood, if you're a boxing enthusiast, which I'm assuming you are by listening to this podcast, even if you don't fight, get in there just to see it. But I go there and I train. Last time I was in there, I got to work with Justin Juco. Justin Juco famously fought Floyd Mayweather, I think in 1999, and Freddie, I believe, was supposed to be Juco's trainer in that bout, and Freddie missed a flight. I think Freddie, and we might hit on Justin Juco. We will definitely talk about the choir boy Freddie Roach in future episodes of this podcast, but just trying to give you a little idea of what you can expect on this podcast. I will jump around, but I think people should know about who Justin Juco is, even though the main episode will probably be about Freddie Roach. I'll also dive into the Ugandan destroyer, Justin Juco. And basically, if you ever get a chance to watch Juco's fight against Mayweather on YouTube, I think they go about 9 rounds. Juco shows so much fight. Certainly Mayweather had his number. But the thing that kind of worked against Juco was Freddie Roach missed a flight. And it wasn't like it was his fault. It was like a weather thing. Flight got canceled, and Freddie was training someone else, I think maybe overseas, and the flight got canceled, and he actually ended up missing JUCO, the biggest fight of JUCO's life. And Pepper Roach is like the second trainer in the corner. So, and also, if you ever see On Freddie Roach, it's on demand. It's called On Freddie Roach. It's on HBO. Check that out. That's a documentary essentially about the Wild Card Boxing Club and Freddie Roach. So, I care passionately about this fight game. I wanted to launch this podcast. I want to continue to put out great material for you guys about boxers from yesteryear. I'm sure you know about Freddie Roach, but on this podcast, you're going to learn about the choir boy. You're going to learn about when he was fighting at the Showboat Casino, which is long gone. That was in the outskirts of Las Vegas, and that's where Freddie would have almost all of his fights. So you're going to learn about Freddie Roach. You're going to learn about the Showboat, because these are things I love. I go into these YouTube rabbit holes, and man, the first time I met Freddie, I was like, I've seen all your fights on YouTube. Like, what was he gonna possibly say to that as a response? But, it's great. I've met a lot of fighters. I'll speak firsthand on my experiences meeting these fighters, and we'll throw some celebrity stories in there as well. Anything that kind of leads back to the fighter that we're talking about. I will tell you stories upon stories, and we will learn about this beautiful sport of kings and why I love it so much, and why I think you should appreciate it too, and appreciate these stories and these characters. So the Twitter account will be @ClearContender. This official Twitter account, my personal Twitter account to learn more about Casey Kid History Callanan, is @Casey Talks Life, CASEY. So I would love to hear feedback from everyone on social media. I'm putting this podcast out as a pure love. So, all those years of watching YouTube, and I have a really good memory. I think you're gonna kind of see that. You'll see that I can pull some stuff out, but it's not a I don't want to be all talk right now, because I definitely want to walk the walk. So, set your expectations high. I really believe in this podcast and this idea. This isn't just something that sprung up overnight. You're gonna get to hear about some of these characters. And man, Pepper Roach, if you ever get a chance, he's an ex-military guy, been in prison. He is the type of he is the reason why I want to get these podcasts out there, because if I can give you a little taste of how fun it is to talk to like a guy like Pepper Roach by you just pulling up a chair and listening to this podcast, to get a little taste of what it might be like as I dive into some Pepper Roach stories down the line, I'm doing my job. Also want to let you know I will be at the June 1st Anthony Joshua fight coming up at Madison Square Garden. I could not be more pumped about that. But this is just an intro episode, so I think I told you enough about me. Surely if you have questions, you will go on Twitter and reach out, because I want to get feedback. This is gonna be a lot better if I hear from y'all, and you can tell me what you like and don't like. Again, I'm not gonna give away the whole editorial calendar on what's coming up, but I kind of gave you a sneak peek talking about Piano Mover Jones and Butch Lewis. So stay tuned, folks. We record this podcast in Baltimore, Maryland, USA. Myself, as I mentioned, I did go to college in West Virginia. I do obviously now live in Baltimore. I was born in Rhode Island. So Vinny Pazienza is indeed my favorite fighter of all time. That's correct. And I was born in Providence, Rhode Island. I am Italian American. I also am half Italian, quarter Irish, quarter Polish. So you can tell that my last name is Callanan, so obviously I'm Irish. But you're gonna see a lot of a lot of how much I love those Italian and Irish fighters come out in this podcast. Also, you're going to see my love of Rhode Island, because Providence has produced some amazing fighters. For such a tiny city, 160,000, I think, is the population. They've produced Vinny Pazienza, who's from Cranston, but that's the town right next to Providence. They've put out Boo Boo, who's fighting right now, Demetrius Andrade, and man, do I wish he would have fought Billy Joe Saunders, because that would have been an incredible fight. I hope somehow that can still happen. So yeah, I'm going to talk about fighters of today as well. But yeah, so just to continue the background on me, so you have a little bit of a biography on me, so you can know who's telling all these stories, right? Who's telling all these stories? So yeah, I'm from Providence originally. When I was a little kid, 6 years old, my dad got a job in Chicago, and we uprooted completely, moved to suburban Chicago. So you can sometimes detect a Chicago accent in me, I think, and sometimes you can detect a Rhode Island accent in me. So that's a unique thing. I don't think there's many people, because I guess I was so young when I lived in both places we always go back to Rhode Island in the summer. That's the place to be. So we would go back to Rhode Island all the time. So I really feel like I got a great upbringing of that Midwest and definitely, of course, the roots of the East Coast. So my dad is from the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey. So you're going to see me talk about these areas at length. And of course, I'm objective, and I try to find what's great about all different parts of not only the United States, but of the world. So I am not going to be biased to Providence, Boston, Chicago. I am going to talk about every character and anything I find important. Shout out to my Canadians. We're going to get a lot of Canadian content out there, because I go to Canada just about every summer. Love it so much. Shout out to my UK friends. I know we got a UK contingent out there listening. I know you're out there. I'll see you at the Anthony Joshua fight at MSG in a couple weeks. Woo! So I will obviously cover UK fighters. I love the UK. I had the absolute pleasure to make my first trip to the UK this past, I guess it was late summer. It was like mid-September, late September, and fell in love with it. Absolutely fell in love with the UK. The fans, I was actually there the day that Joshua was fighting at Wembley, September something of 2018, and didn't get a chance to go out to Wembley. I actually was at a Premier League game earlier in that day. Sorry, Fulham. I was at Fulham. They just got relegated. I was at the Fulham match against Watford, who's having an incredible season. But anyways, I sat next to a ticket broker who was telling me, and I definitely kicked around the idea of going to the Anthony Joshua fight later that night when I was sitting next to this ticket broker, and he told me that for the price and for where you would sit, it was completely pointless for me to even go, because you wouldn't really see anything. Think about it. You can't see a boxing match at all when you're way up at the top of the stands, unless there is an incredible video board. But then again, at that point, why not just, again, watch it at home or something? But some people like to be there in person. I will be at the Anthony Joshua fight. I am so excited. The Wilder fight is in New York City a couple weeks before that. So I am all about going to fights in person. You will hear me talk about it. I will incorporate that into this podcast. I will incorporate my experience, and I will recount to you the interesting things that happen at these fights. The MGM Harbor here in Maryland is starting to get some good fights. MGM National Harbor down there in like National Harbor of Maryland. It's not far from here. I'll try to make it out to fights there. Most definitely love New York City. My best friends from college all live in Manhattan and in the surrounding boroughs, and so I will be up at MSG fights, and I wanted to go to the Wilder fight, but it was just too close. It's going to be May 18th, a couple weeks before the Anthony Joshua fight, and that's going to be in Brooklyn at the Barclays Center, but I couldn't make it to both, and they were just too close to each other, so I'm definitely going to the Joshua fight. I made my pick. The tickets were way more, and I'm not going as media. I'm not I'm definitely not, I'm going as a fan, and I will recount my experience with you as a fan. For those of you who might be wondering, the Anthony Joshua fight was exponentially more expensive than going to the Deontay Wilder fight. The one's in Brooklyn in May. The Deontay Wilder fight's in Brooklyn in May, and the Anthony Joshua fight is in MSG, Madison Square Garden, the world's most famous arena, as they claim, a couple weeks later. And the Anthony Joshua fight, tickets were just so much more expensive. But gotta go, gotta do it. I can't wait to get in that building and hear the UK fans, the first fight of Anthony Joshua in the US. Are you kidding me? We will be there, baby. Clear Contender Media, that is the parent company of this podcast. We are going to be there. You know, just me and my girlfriend, Soraya. The lovely Soraya, who will be on a future episode. Keep her in mind. She's awesome. I can't wait for you guys to meet her. But yeah, I'm going to be there, New York City. We will recount all of that experience. I'm so excited for it. Does Big Baby have a chance? I think we're going to profile Big Baby because Jarrell Miller is interesting, and I want you guys to know about him. Does Big Baby have a chance? I'm not going to get into that right now. You're going to have to stay tuned to this podcast. So, and we will learn about Big Baby. Anthony Joshua is from Watford, isn't he? Wow. So it's going to be Watford versus Brooklyn at that Anthony Joshua fight. And as an American, as a fight fan, who will I be rooting for? I just told you I love the UK. Had an amazing time there, but I'm from here. Who will I be rooting for? I'm probably going to go out there neutral, but to be fair to you, if Jarrell Miller started getting a couple good combos in there and the crowd started feeding off that energy, you better believe I will be all over that. That's what a fight is. If the underdog is making a name for himself, you got to get behind him. It's like March Madness. Once the underdog starts, chipping away at the big dog, you got to support the underdog. So we'll see. We'll talk more about that. I'm excited about it, as you can tell. But yeah, that's me. That's me. That's what this podcast is going to be about. There was some cool stuff. I was on a plane recently. I was on a Southwest plane. I forget where I was coming back from, but I was listening to like an older episode of Dan Carlin's. He hosts Hardcore History. He was actually on like an old episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, and I was planning on sleeping on like the whole flight, but I wanted to have the podcast in. So Carlin, and I had no idea he was going to do this. He starts talking about the history of boxing and how in the U.S. you can trace back the U.S. history of immigration is linked to boxing. So if you look at boxing, you can see who the most recent wave of immigrants are in the U.S. So Carlin, when he was on the podcast, was talking about this, and I was like, I was right about to launch this podcast, and I ended up hearing him talk about how the most recent wave of immigrants, if it was the Jews coming over from Europe, if it was the Italians, if it was the Irish, African Americans have always been involved in the fight game since the days of Jack Johnson, and that hasn't changed. The Italians you see here and there, they're not as much obviously now as there was before. Irish, again, kind of like the same as the Italians. It wavers when you see an Irish fighter. Peter McNeely, shout out. We're going to have an episode about Peter McNeely. The Jewish fighters, you don't see anymore really too much, although, and he wasn't a Jewish American. I believe he was from Israel. Yuri Foreman. I will love to tell you guys about Yuri Foreman. Kind of his history. He fought Miguel Cotto at Yankee Stadium 12 years ago. And if you watch that fight and you love boxing as much as me, you might tear up about how incredible and inspiring that fight is. If you watch a great fight, I get inspired. When I see Greg Haugen get knocked around on YouTube from Julio Cesar Chavez, and Haugen not quit in front of 100,000 Mexican screaming fans, him being 4,000 miles from his home, and Haugen's getting knocked around, but Haugen ain't quitting. That's motivating. If Haugen can do that, I can get up and do XYZ today. Do you kind of see how I look at boxing and kind of relate it to life and try to use it as inspiration in life? So anyways, Carlin talks about how the marginalized groups in America were always looking to make a name for themselves in the boxing ring. And I think a lot of that history will be reflected in this podcast. We will talk about those great fighters of yesteryear. Of course, we are going to be talking about, coming back to the Jews, we're going to be talking about Benny Leonard. We're going to be talking about, although he certainly is not part of this immigration wave, but we're going to be talking about Dana Rosenblatt. And nowadays, what you see, and when Carlin was talking about this, Joe Rogan chimes in and goes, well, yeah, and now it's a lot of the Eastern Europeans, and they are huge right now in the boxing scene. But from Rogan thinks to point to, these people are from tough environments, and they come from places of conflict. They also made the point on this podcast that kids don't go, kids from middle class privileged backgrounds aren't going into boxing now, which I find interesting. And I understand why that's the case. You look at a story like a guy like Deontay Wilder, who was driving a beer truck in Alabama, and the only reason he got into boxing was so he could have a way to afford the hospital bills of his daughter. That is what else can you say? I can't even editorialize on that. How powerful is that? People are coming from rough backgrounds and they look at boxing as a way out. Of course, that's always been the case, and it is the case today. Wilder's case is unheard of because he's just so freakishly talented. But the point that they were making is, kids today who come from privileged backgrounds in the United States, I can't speak for any other country right now, but kids who come from privileged backgrounds don't get involved in boxing. And certainly, I remember Mike Tyson talking about how he would not want his son to have to go against someone who was like himself as a young man. Mike Tyson was on that warpath as a young man. Mike Tyson, well documented his incredibly tough background before Cus D'Amato was able to help, turn his life around and bring him to glory. But Tyson was saying he would never want his son to fight, and is that going to hurt the sport? I don't think so, because I think that's just a trend that's happening in the United States to privileged kids. But do I think privileged kids should go into fighting? I think they should train. I think they should learn the technical side. I'm not saying they need to get in the ring and get their bell rung, but I think learning the discipline side from a cardiovascular standpoint is going to improve them. Yeah, they should be boxing. They should be understanding the sport. And it is at the end of the day, it is a good last resort as a self-defense piece. Of course, you can make the argument that other martial arts or ultimate fighting type styles are going to be more effective. I think the way that you're taught to duck in boxing, where you move your head forward, can not necessarily be the best thing in a street fight, because you could get kneed in the face. But learning boxing, these kids should be learning boxing no matter what background they're coming from. Do they have to get in the ring and spar and risk brain damage? No, I'm not saying that, but they should be learning the sport. And there should be more boxing gyms out there catering to younger individuals. But certainly I find that to be a sad, possibly a sad trend if kids are scared to get into at least the training aspects of boxing, which I am deeply involved in and love, and there's nothing more satisfying than learning the ropes about boxing technique. So tune into the first episode. It's coming up next week. Check us out, and peace out. Subscribe, give reviews, whatever you got to do. Stick with us, though. Most importantly, just listen. I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm just trying to bring you some history, baby. All right.
Thanks for listening to the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Clear Contender Media. For more, visit us on clearcontender.com.